Well, there are a lot of things that are quite specific to the NI dominant experience. I've made plenty of videos where I try to, provide evidence of that. But one experience that perhaps I have not covered as often is simply the experience of discovering that you are an NI dominant. So notice that there's a distinction, right? On the one hand, you have the experience of being an NI dominant, but without knowing that you are in fact an NI dominant, right? So there's the experience of just being a person who answers to the NI dominance, who would answer to the NI dominant description if they were aware of it. And on the other hand, you have the same person who's aware that they are NI dominant, okay? So of course, those are slightly different kinds of experiences. There's experience without the knowledge that you're an NI dominant, and there's experience with the knowledge that you are in fact an NI dominant. And my argument here is the following, and it's based on my own thinking, my own analysis, but also interacting with a lot of INFJs, some INTJs over the years, reading comments, interacting with some Patreon supporters as well, including some recent ones who have been describing to me their experience of discovering that they are INFJ, for example, and how life-changing that has been, like almost like a complete reset of how they view the world. Sometimes even at a later stage in life, which is really, really interesting. And to me, what has been striking is this idea that it seems to be, at some level and for some reason, more life-changing for NI dominant. My experience is primarily of INFJs, but it has happened with INTJs as well, for sure, including people who first identified as INFJ and then eventually moved on to INTJ. There is something life-changing in the experience. There's something world-changing in the experience, something that it seems to be, on average, more intense than the experience for someone to discover that they're ENTJ or ENTP or INFP or ISTJ, and so forth and so on. So it bears kind of reflecting what it is, what is it that makes it so significant for a person to discover that they are NI dominant? And why do they consider it on average to be such a significant experience, such a life-changing experience? Because you can understand people finding it very interesting, people saying, oh, well, it's another tool in my self-analysis. I can view myself through that prism now, which is really good. It's helpful. There's lots of good things about reasoning in this way, but for NI dominance, for some reason, the experience just seems to go deeper. And reflecting on that, I have come to the conclusion that one very useful way that we can think of why this is the case is, again, through a concept that I've been developing in the last year or so, which is the holistic minds of NI dominance. If you have mental holism as your mind framework, you are a whole. Your mind is a whole. You cannot really change one part without changing all the other parts to some degree. This is the opposition between holism of mind and atomism of mind, which is something that I often describe the atomism of mind to be specific to more any users, where you can actually have different bits of data that don't really cohere together, but they can still coexist within your mental framework. That enables the super rapid lateral thinking of NI dominance, but also sometimes what seems like a lack of overall coherent narrative. Compare that with the hyper-coherent and holistic narrative of NI dominance, but perhaps by comparison, their slower mode of thinking and less lateral mode of thinking. It's almost like more vertical at some level. I think that the mental holism of people who in fact are INFJs or INTJs but don't know that means that when they experience, right, the discovery that they are, first of all, there was something in them that felt that hunger. There was something in their lives that was probably missing, which is why they've been in pursuit. And they had an intuition, right, which is something that NI does as well. It gives you kind of flashes of insight, intuitions, gut feelings. You don't exactly know where you're headed, but you have this kind of certainty that you're heading somewhere. You know, this is also the experience of prescience, which I describe in my book, The Ecstatic Soul. Now, and in The Infinite Soul, of course, but first articulated in The Ecstatic Soul. The idea here is that you feel like something needs to change in your mental framework, right? That your mental framework is kind of not really aligned with reality in the way that it should be from your own perspective, the perspective of your mind, the perspective of your soul, the perspective of your overall personality. So you feel there is any. If you encounter the INFJ description and you realize you're that type, I think that the significance and intensity of the experience is a reflection of the fact that your mental holism has to update as a whole because it is a holism. So you get this new piece of information, you're an INFJ or an INTJ, well, everything has to change. Even if it's a moderate change, even if it's a slight change or a big change, depending on where, you know, within the overall web of beliefs and propositional attitudes you're looking at, there needs to be change everywhere. So that in a sense, there really is a reset of your entire mental framework. It's updated in view of this new piece of information, as opposed to someone who's more of any user could be like, oh, cool, you know, I'm this, and then move on. Or someone who maybe has NI lower in their stack and could do that as well. But if you're an NI user and you're in fact an NI dominant, this whole idea of a holistic reset, I think, is inevitable, which also means, according to this hypothesis, that first of all, the NI dominance has to be convinced that this is useful, because they know implicitly that if they accept this new piece of information, then the whole system will have to be reset. So it might be harder for an NI dominant to bring themselves to take this particular framework of personality seriously and embrace it for themselves. But once they, compared to maybe other types who are a bit more casual about it, they'll embrace it, but not too seriously, or seriously, but not as wholeheartedly. But once the NI dominant decides to embrace it, then it's a thoroughgoing change of mental worldview. And I think that this reaction, this very human reaction, depth of meaning, this reset of the way they view the world and themselves in the world at different stages in life, this is an existential experience for INFJs and INTJs. But I think it's explained by the holism of the NI mind. Let me know in the comments if you have another hypothesis or what you think of my hypothesis. And yeah, looking forward to you reading your comments. And don't forget that if you want to hear more about these topics, you have these two books. So like I talked a bit about the Ecstatic Soul earlier, which is an in-depth look at the INFJ mind, right? INFJ life in the modern world. You can get it, check the reviews. There's 128 reviews now, which is crazy, and 4.5 stars. So, you know, it might be a good, you know, if you want to go for an in-depth investigation of the INFJ mind. This is The Infinite Soul, my more recent book on INFJ life in the modern world, where I discuss ways of finding purpose, happiness, and fulfillment in a world that is often seen as hostile to us. How can we live as INFJs? How can we evolve, progress, and grow as INFJs? This is the book to get. You can get the two together, this prequel and sequel. It's very obvious. And don't forget, my channel relies on the lifeblood, which is Patreon support. So please consider click on the link below. If you'd like to support me anywhere from $3.50 a month, you can interact with me there. There's a growing community, new supporters lately who've been responding to my call. I'm very appreciative. You can make suggestions to me for new videos. I'm always eager for that. We do some young readings and other things. Okay, so consider it, and I'll talk to you next time, guys. Bye-bye.